In 1942, Japanese commanders looked at the Australians sent to stop them and laughed. They called them chocolate soldiers, militia boys, part-timers, untrained, under-equipped, supposed to melt in the tropical heat. The Japanese army had swept through Malaya, crushed Singapore, overrun the Philippines, driven seasoned Allied units into the sea. And now, a battalion of Australian militia stood in their way. The 39th Battalion. Most had never fired a shot in anger. Most had never left Australia, and within weeks they would be starving, soaked, wounded, and retreating through a mountain jungle so brutal that even veterans would break inside it. The Japanese believed this would be easy. They were wrong. Because what happened on the Kokoda Track wasn't a collapse. It was a slow, grinding war of attrition that handed the Imperial Japanese Army its first major land defeat in the Pacific. And it began with boys the enemy thought would melt. If you're new here, subscribe now. Because on this channel, we don't just tell war stories, we break down the moments that changed the psychology of entire armies. And Kokoda? Kokoda changed everything. Before you can understand Kokoda, you have to understand the terrain. Because the Kokoda Track was not a road. It was not even a proper path. It was a narrow, muddy scar carved through the Owen Stanley Mountains of Papua New Guinea. Nearly 100 kilometers of vertical jungle slopes, knife-edge ridgelines, swamps, river crossings that could drown a man in seconds, heat by day and freezing cold by night. This was not European warfare. There were no tanks, no wide front lines, no artillery barrages rolling across open fields. The Kokoda campaign would be fought at distances measured in meters, sometimes feet, and the Japanese believed they could cross it in 2 weeks. In July 1942, the Japanese High Command was executing a broader strategy. After taking Rabaul, they aimed to isolate Australia by capturing Port Moresby. If Port Moresby fell, northern Australia would be within striking distance. Originally, Japan planned a seaborne invasion. But the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 disrupted that. So they pivoted. Instead of landing at Port Moresby directly, they would land on the northern coast of Papua, at Buna and Gona, and march across the mountains, on foot. The Japanese forces assigned to this operation were battle-hardened troops of the South Seas Detachment, commanded by Major General Tomitaro Hori. These were not militia. These were veterans of China, men trained for offensive warfare, confident, aggressive, used to winning. Their intelligence suggested they faced little serious resistance. Australian regular divisions were fighting in North Africa. What stood between them and Port Moresby? Militia. And the first of those militia units to meet them was the 39th Battalion. The 39th Battalion was part of the citizen military forces, not full-time soldiers. They trained part-time, weekend, drills, limited equipment, minimal jungle training. Their average age? Early 20s, some younger. They had old First World War-era weapons, limited machine guns, few mortars, almost no artillery support, and air cover? Unreliable at best. Yet in July 1942, these men were sent forward to defend Kokoda Airstrip, a critical supply point in the mountains. Not because they were ready, but because there was no one else. When Japanese reconnaissance units first encountered them, reports filtered back up the chain of command. The Australians were retreating, falling back from position to position, yielding ground. To the Japanese, this confirmed their assumptions. The Australians were breaking. They used a term that translated roughly to chocolate soldiers, men who would melt under pressure. But what looked like collapse was something else entirely. The first serious clash came near Awala and then Kokoda in late July 1942. The Japanese attacked aggressively, using infiltration. Tactics honed in China. They moved through jungle flanks, appeared suddenly in rear positions, forced the Australians into fighting at point-blank range. The 39th Battalion fell back, again and again. But they did not disintegrate. They did not rout. They withdrew in fighting order, preserving manpower, slowing the advance, buying time. Every ridge they abandoned cost the Japanese blood. And here's the detail that changes the tone of this story. The Japanese supply line stretched thin as they advanced. Every bullet, every ration, every medical supply had to be carried on foot, through jungle, through mud, up mountains. The further they advanced, the more fragile their logistics became. The Australians, falling back toward Port Moresby, were shortening their own supply line. What looked like defeat was geography turning into a weapon. Then came Isurava, and everything changed. By late August 1942, reinforcements began arriving, including elements of the AIF 214th and 216th battalions. But the 39th remained in the line, exhausted, undersupplied, malaria spreading, boots rotting. Yet they held positions against repeated Japanese assaults. At Isurava, they would fight one of the most desperate defensive actions in Australian military history. And the Japanese would discover something they had not encountered in Malaya, an enemy that would not break, even while retreating. The myth of Japanese invincibility was about to meet jungle reality. And the 39th Battalion, the so-called chocolate soldiers, were about to prove they did not melt. They hardened. By late August 1942, the retreat had carried the Australians to a place called Isurava. If Kokoda was a test, Isurava was a reckoning. The 39th Battalion had already been fighting for weeks. They had marched, fought, withdrawn, buried their dead, and marched again. Many had not slept properly in days. Malaria was spreading. Dysentery was common. Rations were thin. Ammunition thinner. Boots were rotting from constant moisture. Rifles jammed in the humidity. But they were still in the line. And now, for the first time, the Japanese committed serious force against them. General Hori believed the Australians were close to breaking. He ordered a concentrated push through Isurava. His troops outnumbered the defenders significantly. Estimates suggest roughly 5,000 Japanese troops pressing against fewer than 2,000 Australians across the broader front, many of them exhausted militia. And unlike earlier skirmishes, this would not be maneuver warfare. This would be close-range jungle killing. Isurava wasn't a town in the traditional sense. It was a ridge. Control the ridge, and you controlled movement along the track. Lose it, and the road to Port Moresby opened further. The Australians dug in along high ground, thin, stretched, but disciplined. The 39th Battalion anchored key positions alongside AIF reinforcements. And then the Japanese attacked. The jungle erupted at distances measured in meters. The fighting at Isurava was not cinematic. It was intimate. Japanese soldiers infiltrated through the jungle flanks, appeared suddenly at the edges of Australian positions. Bayonet charges were common. Machine guns fired through foliage at shapes barely visible. Mortars fell into tree canopies, sending splintered wood and shrapnel down like rain. It was the kind of fighting that destroys nerves before bodies. On August 28, 1942, one moment would become symbolic of the entire campaign. Private Bruce Kingsbury of the 2nd 14th Battalion, an AIF reinforcement, saw his position collapsing under heavy Japanese assault. The enemy had broken through parts of the line. Australian defenders were falling back. The ridge was close to being overrun. Kingsbury grabbed a Bren gun, charged forward, and fired into advancing Japanese troops at close range. He cut down multiple enemy soldiers, bought critical seconds, stabilized the line. Moments later, he was killed by sniper fire. He was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously, the first for an Australian on Australian territory. But Kingsbury's charge was not the turning point. It was proof of something larger. The Japanese had expected the militia to disintegrate under sustained assault. Instead, even when forced to fall back, the Australians counterattacked locally, regrouped, re-established positions. They bled, but they did not collapse. Japanese reports began noting unusually stubborn resistance. The assumption that this would be another Malaya began to weaken. Operationally, something critical was happening. The Japanese supply situation was deteriorating. Every meter forward required more food carried by hand, more ammunition dragged uphill. Medical evacuation was nearly impossible. Rain turned the track into mud so deep that men sometimes lost boots in it. Disease spread on both sides. But the Japanese had planned for a short campaign. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Now they were locked in a prolonged, attritional struggle in mountains they had underestimated. And attrition was the one type of war the Japanese had not planned to fight here. By early September, the Australians were ordered to withdraw from Isurava, not because they were beaten, but because the line risked encirclement. And here's where the narrative gets misunderstood. Yes, they retreated, but they did so deliberately, in order, preserving combat power. Every fallback shortened their supply line to Port Moresby. Every Japanese advance lengthened theirs. The mountains themselves were beginning to fight on Australia's side. Hori's men were exhausted. Rations were cut, rice spoiled. Men began eating roots and whatever jungle vegetation they could find. Malaria cases climbed. Ammunition had to be rationed. Meanwhile, Australian reinforcements continued arriving, not in overwhelming numbers, but steadily. The 39th Battalion, once alone, was now part of a growing defensive force, and for the first time since the Pacific War began, the Japanese advance began to slow. From Isurava to Ura Creek and Templeton's Crossing, the fighting continued. Ridge by ridge, creek by creek, withdrawal followed by ambush, ambush followed by withdrawal. The Australians learned fast. They adapted to jungle warfare, used terrain to negate Japanese maneuver tactics, forced frontal engagements where possible, and most importantly, they endured. The myth that Japanese troops could not be stopped on land had been built on rapid offensive momentum. In New Guinea, that momentum stalled, and stalled momentum is the beginning of defeat. By mid-September 1942, Japanese commanders began facing a problem they had not expected. They were running out of strength before reaching Port Moresby. The Australians were not melting, they were hardening. Then came Ioribaiwa Ridge, the closest the Japanese would ever come to Port Moresby. From Ioribaiwa, on clear days, Japanese forward elements could see the lights of Port Moresby in the distance. It must have felt within reach. Victory almost tangible. But what they did not know was this: their offensive had already peaked. Behind them, supply lines were collapsing. Ahead of them, Australian resistance was strengthening. And in the wider Pacific, something else had happened. At Guadalcanal, Japanese forces were now fighting a major battle. Resources were being stretched. Hori's men were ordered to halt, then to withdraw. The laughter stopped somewhere between Isurava and Ioribaiwa. The Japanese had not been defeated in one decisive battle. They had been worn down, bled slowly, stopped by men they thought would melt. The 39th Battalion had not won through grand maneuver, they had won by refusing to disappear. And in doing so, they handed the Japanese Army its first major land check in the Pacific. But the story wasn't over, because now the Australians would have to do something even harder than holding. They would have to advance, through the same jungle, against an enemy that had learned from them. By mid-September 1942, the Japanese had reached Ioribaiwa Ridge. From its heights, on clear days, they could see Port Moresby in the distance, the objective of their entire campaign. Close enough to imagine victory, close enough to believe the Australians were finally finished. But the Japanese army had never fought a campaign like this, and the mountains were starting to fight back. General Tomitaro Hori's South Seas Detachment had marched nearly 100 kilometers across some of the harshest terrain on Earth. On paper, they were elite. Veterans of China, disciplined, aggressive, used to rapid offensive movement. But Kokoda was not China. There were no broad plains, no railheads, no reliable resupply. Everything they needed, food, ammunition, medicine, had to be carried on foot, through jungle, through mud, through rain that never seemed to stop. Japanese rations had already been cut. Rice ran low. Men began eating roots, local plants, sometimes captured Australian supplies. Malaria spread. Dysentery spread faster. Boots disintegrated. Men wrapped their feet in rags. Wounded soldiers were often left behind because evacuation was nearly impossible. And every day the Australians were still there, falling back, but still fighting. What had been planned as a 2-week march had turned into a war of endurance. And endurance was not what Hori had planned for. On the Australian side, the situation was also desperate. The 39th Battalion had been reduced severely by casualties and disease. They were no longer alone. AIF. Reinforcements had strengthened the line, but exhaustion was universal. Men were operating on minimal sleep, minimal food, minimal comfort. Yet something had changed. The Australians were no longer retreating blindly. They were learning the jungle. They had adapted. Japanese intelligence began reporting something unsettling. Australian resistance was not collapsing. In fact, it appeared to be stiffening. Where earlier engagements had forced rapid withdrawals, now every ridge required costly assaults. Every meter gained required blood. And supply officers were reporting a critical problem. There was not enough food to reach Port Moresby, let alone fight for it. Then came the wider strategic shock. While Hori's men were grinding forward in the mountains, events elsewhere in the Pacific shifted dramatically. At Guadalcanal, American forces had launched a major offensive. Japan now faced a new priority. Resources were stretched. Air and naval assets were being diverted. The Port Moresby overland push, once bold and aggressive, suddenly looked expensive and uncertain. Orders arrived, first to pause, then to reassess, then, quietly, to withdraw. This was the moment the laughter truly ended. The Japanese army had not suffered a catastrophic battlefield defeat, but momentum, the weapon that had carried them through Southeast Asia, was gone. They had not broken the Australians. The Australians had slowed them, bled them, denied them speed. And in mountain warfare, loss of speed is loss of initiative. Loss of initiative is the beginning of defeat. And when the Australians realized the Japanese were pulling back, everything changed. Withdrawal in jungle warfare is dangerous. The side retreating is vulnerable. Supply lines exposed. Rear guards stretched thin. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese troops were withdrawing from a land campaign they had initiated. And now, the Australians would do something they had not yet done in this war. They would advance. The counteroffensive was slow, methodical, relentless. Where once the 39th Battalion had fallen back ridge by ridge, now they reclaimed them. Isurava, Templeton's Crossing, Eora Creek. Each position contested again. But now the Japanese were the ones digging in defensively, and they were doing so while starving. The retreat became increasingly chaotic. Hori attempted to maintain order. Rearguard actions were fought fiercely. Japanese discipline remained strong. But logistics were gone. Medical supplies were gone. Food was nearly gone. Men collapsed on the track. Some drowned attempting river crossings during retreat. In October 1942, General Hori himself drowned while attempting to cross the Kumusi River during withdrawal. The commander who had marched confidently toward Port Moresby never reached safety. This was no longer a stalled offensive. It was a broken one. The Australians continued pushing northward, not recklessly, but steadily. They reclaimed Kokoda. They pushed toward Buna and Gona. And the narrative of Japanese invincibility, carefully constructed through early war victories, fractured, not shattered instantly, but cracked permanently. For the men of the 39th Battalion, victory did not feel triumphant. It felt exhausted. They had lost friends, buried mates in shallow jungle graves, watched men rot from disease, seen fear up close. Many were evacuated due to illness before the campaign even ended. But something irreversible had happened. They had faced an elite Japanese force, outnumbered, outgunned, undersupplied, and they had not broken. And in war, sometimes not breaking is the most important victory of all. The Japanese had reached the high water mark of their southern advance at Ioribaiwa. They never reached Port Moresby, never planted their flag on the ridge, never completed the overland march. Instead, they retreated back toward the northern coast. And the Kokoda campaign became the first major land check to Japanese expansion in the Pacific. But the fighting was not over, because now the battle would move north to Buna, Gona, and Sanananda, where jungle attrition would reach even more brutal levels, and where both armies would discover that Kokoda had only been the beginning. The Japanese retreat from the mountains did not end the campaign. It dragged the war north, to the swamps, to the beaches, to Buna. And this time, there would be no illusion of momentum left. If Kokoda broke the advance, Buna would break the army. When the Japanese forces withdrew from Ioribaiwa and fell back through the mountains, they did not retreat cleanly. They staggered. They fought delaying actions. They abandoned equipment. And by the time they reached the northern coast, they were physically diminished. But they were still dangerous, still disciplined, still unwilling to surrender. At Buna and Gona, they dug in. This was no open battlefield. The terrain at Buna was worse than Kokoda in a different way. Not mountains, swamp, waterlogged jungle, knee-deep mud, mangroves, mosquitoes thick enough to choke on. There were no clear fields of fire, no high ground advantage, just short-range, brutal, suffocating combat. Japanese engineers constructed fortified bunkers from coconut logs, earth, and sand. They built low-profile defensive nests almost invisible under foliage. Machine gun positions overlapped, firing arcs intersected. The Australians would later describe them as nearly impossible to detect until you were within lethal range. These were not temporary fighting holes. They were deliberate defensive strongholds, and the Japanese were prepared to die in them. The Australians now had to do something they hadn't yet done in this war: attack head-on. By late November 1942, Australian and American forces began assaulting Japanese positions at Buna and Gona. The 39th Battalion, battered, reduced but still present, was part of the broader offensive force. The advance was slow, painfully slow. An attack might gain 10 meters at the cost of dozens of casualties. The Japanese did not counterattack recklessly anymore. They held, they waited, they fired at close range, and they refused surrender. Australian soldiers described crawling through swamp water toward bunkers they couldn't fully see. Machine gun bursts would erupt from concealed positions. Men fell face first into mud. Medics struggled through water and fire to retrieve wounded. Flamethrowers were introduced to clear fortified bunkers. Grenades were thrown at point-blank range. The fighting was no longer maneuver warfare. It was reduced. One bunker, then another, and this is where the cost of the Japanese mountain gamble finally came due. Because the Japanese at Buna were starving. The overland march had consumed supplies. Allied air superiority disrupted resupply by sea. Food was critically short. Medical care is almost non-existent. Malaria and dysentery ravaged both sides. But the Japanese defensive doctrine demanded endurance to the last. They would not withdraw again. They would not surrender, which meant they would die in place. Japanese morale had shifted. This was no longer an advance toward glory. It was a fight for survival. The Australians could feel it. The Japanese defensive fire was fierce, but no longer confident. There were fewer counterattacks, more static resistance. The offensive spirit that had driven them through Malaya was gone. It had been consumed in the mountains. By January 1943, the campaign ended not with surrender, but with silence. Buna fell, then Gona, then Sanananda. Japanese positions were overrun. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were killed. Very few were captured alive. It was one of the bloodiest jungle campaigns of the Pacific War, and it marked something significant. The first time a Japanese land campaign in the Pacific had been decisively reversed and crushed. The Japanese Army had begun 1942 undefeated in land combat across Southeast Asia. By early 1943, that aura was broken, not shattered in one spectacular battle, but worn down, stopped, then driven back. And the beginning of that reversal had not been at Buna. It had been on the Kokoda Track, where a militia battalion refused to melt. The men of the 39th Battalion were exhausted beyond measure. Many were evacuated for illness. Some would never fully recover physically. But they had held the line when holding seemed impossible. They had endured when endurance was the only strategy available. And in doing so, they had changed the strategic direction of the war in New Guinea. The Japanese never attempted another overland push toward Port Moresby. The southern expansion had reached its limit, and the myth of unstoppable Japanese land forces had died somewhere in the mud of the Owen Stanley Mountains. Before Kokoda, the Japanese Army carried an aura. Malaya had fallen in weeks. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in February 1942. British forces, Indian divisions, Australian regulars, all had collapsed under Japanese speed and aggression. The myth of Japanese invincibility wasn't propaganda. It was built on real victories. And in July 1942, when Japanese intelligence assessed the Kokoda defenders, they saw no reason to doubt that pattern: militia, citizen soldiers, part-timers. They believed they would melt. But Kokoda exposed a fatal miscalculation. Japanese planning for the overland assault assumed three things. First, that Australian resistance would collapse under sustained pressure. Second, that the terrain, while difficult, could be crossed quickly. Third, that Port Moresby would fall before supply became critical. All three assumptions failed. Not because Japan lacked courage, not because their troops lacked discipline, but because they underestimated something intangible: endurance. The 39th Battalion was not superior in firepower, not superior in numbers, not even superior in experience. But they possessed something the Japanese had not measured correctly: a willingness to endure loss without disintegration. They retreated but remained organized. They suffered but remained in formation. They adapted faster than expected. And in mountain warfare, adaptation outweighs aggression. After the campaign, Japanese assessments acknowledged severe logistical misjudgment. The track was far worse than anticipated. Air resupply was insufficient. Medical evacuation impossible. The offensive timetable is unrealistic. But beneath the logistics lay something more subtle. The Australians had not behaved like a beaten militia. They had behaved like professionals. The chocolate soldiers label quietly disappeared from reports. And on the other side of the mountains, something else was happening. In Australia, the campaign struck a nerve. In early 1942, fear had gripped the nation. Singapore had fallen. Darwin had been bombed. Japanese expansion appeared unstoppable. There were real concerns that Australia itself could be invaded. The 39th Battalion stand at Kokoda became more than a military episode. It became proof that the Japanese could be stopped, not by distant British forces, not by American reinforcements, but by Australians, on terrain brutal enough to break anyone. The Kokoda campaign subtly altered Australian military identity. For decades, Gallipoli and the Western Front had defined national war memory. But Kokoda was different. It was defensive. It was close to home. It was jungle, not trench. and it was fought by a militia battalion often underestimated by its own leadership. The 39th Battalion's endurance became a symbol of resilience rather than glory. Not conquest, not a spectacle, just stubborn survival. But national myth often simplifies what war actually costs, because Kokoda was not clean heroism. It was disease, malnutrition, psychological trauma. Australian casualties were severe. More than 600 Australians were killed during the Kokoda campaign. Thousands were wounded or incapacitated by illness. Many survivors carried malaria for the rest of their lives. Victory did not feel triumphant in the moment. It felt like survival. And on the Japanese side, the cost was catastrophic. Estimates suggest over 13,000 Japanese troops were committed to the campaign. More than half became casualties through combat, disease, or starvation. It was one of the first major examples in the Pacific War of Japanese forces being halted, reversed, and destroyed in sustained land operations. And it happened not through overwhelming Allied superiority, but through grinding attrition. The laughter at the beginning of the campaign now seemed dangerously misplaced. The Japanese command had believed the Australians would melt in heat and mud. Instead, it was Japanese logistics and momentum that dissolved. The mountains punished overconfidence and punished speed without sustainment. The 39th Battalion did not win by crushing the enemy in a single decisive strike. They won by refusing to collapse long enough for geography and time to do their work. Kokoda proved something critical in the Pacific War. Japanese infantry, though highly disciplined and tactically aggressive, were not immune to attritional strain. When deprived of rapid maneuver and adequate supply, their advantage diminished. The aura of unstoppable advance faded. That psychological shift would echo across later campaigns, from Guadalcanal to New Guinea to the Philippines. And yet, the 39th Battalion did not see themselves as myth-makers. They saw themselves as exhausted young men who had done what was required. Many would later say they never felt heroic, only tired. They buried mates along the track. They endured constant rain. They watched disease consume men as quickly as bullets. Their achievement was not cinematic. It was cumulative. And cumulative endurance wins wars more often than dramatic victories. The Japanese never again attempted an overland assault toward Port Moresby. The southern expansion had reached its limit, and in the mud of Kokoda, the narrative of inevitable Japanese dominance had fractured. Not shattered overnight, but permanently cracked. Strip away the legend for a moment. Look at Kokoda clinically. Japan began 1942 undefeated in major land campaigns across Southeast Asia. British Malaya collapsed. Singapore surrendered. The Philippines fell. The Dutch East Indies were overrun. Everywhere the Imperial Japanese Army advanced, it advanced fast. Aggressive maneuver, rapid encirclement, shock. That was the pattern. Kokoda broke that pattern. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese land forces initiated an offensive and failed to complete it. The Port Moresby overland assault did not stall because of a single decisive battle. It stalled because of compounding strain, overextended supply lines, inadequate jungle intelligence, air superiority lost at critical moments, underestimation of local resistance, and terrain that neutralized speed. Operationally, the campaign exposed a flaw in Japanese expansion doctrine. Momentum is only useful if you can sustain it. The South Seas Detachment had not planned for attrition. They had planned for breakthrough. When breakthrough failed, the offensive collapsed inward. Japanese soldiers on the Kokoda Track carried their world on their backs. Rations were calculated for a rapid advance. But the track turned rapid movement into weeks of grinding climb. Every kilometer forward required exponentially more effort to resupply. Artillery was minimal. Heavy weapons are difficult to transport. Medical support almost non-existent once deep into the mountains. By the time Hori reached Ioribaiwa Ridge, the offensive had outrun its own oxygen. The army was still standing, but it was no longer capable of decisive action, and that is the moment the war in New Guinea changed direction. When Hori received orders to withdraw, the initiative passed permanently. Not temporarily, permanently. From that point forward, Japan would fight defensive campaigns in New Guinea. Allied forces would dictate tempo. The mountains had flipped the script, and the 39th Battalion had been the first weight placed on that scale. Now step back from the maps. Look at the faces. The 39th Battalion were not professional regulars. They were citizen military forces, bank clerks, farmhands, factory workers, boys who trained part-time. Many had never seen combat before July 1942, and they were sent into one of the most brutal environments of the Second World War. The Japanese expected them to melt. They hardened instead. They retreated. Yes, they gave ground. Yes. But they never dissolved. They never panicked en masse. They never surrendered the track cheaply. Every ridge cost the Japanese something. Every delay compounded supply strain. Every organized fallback shortened Australia's logistical reach and lengthened Japan's. The retreat was not collapse. It was resistance measured in inches. More than 600 Australians died in the Kokoda campaign. Thousands more were hospitalized with malaria and tropical disease. Some veterans would later say disease frightened them more than bullets. Jungle rot ate at their feet. Leeches fed constantly. Rain never stopped. They buried mates in shallow graves carved from mud. Victory did not feel triumphant. It felt survived. Japanese casualties were devastating. Over half of the 13,000 troops committed to the campaign became casualties. Many died not from Australian bullets, but from starvation and disease. The overland gamble had consumed an elite detachment. The Imperial Army would never again treat Papua as an easy crossing. The myth of effortless expansion was gone, and myths matter in war. Before Kokoda, Allied troops across the Pacific feared Japanese infantry as unstoppable. After Kokoda, something subtle changed. If militia could stop them, if exhaustion could blunt them, if terrain could bleed them, then perhaps they were not invincible. That shift in belief matters. Armies fight not just with weapons, but with confidence. Kokoda eroded one side's confidence and strengthened the other's. After the Japanese withdrawal from the track, the Ioribaiwa campaign did not end. It shifted. The Australians, reinforced now by AIF units and American troops, moved north toward Buna and Gona. And here, the fighting became even more brutal. Buna was not open mountain, it was swamp, coastal jungle, interlocking bunker systems. The Japanese had dug in, camouflaged positions, log-covered fortifications, fields of fire barely visible until you walked into them. This was no longer endurance. This was close-quarters annihilation. Allied troops attacked repeatedly in late 1942. Progress was measured in meters. Casualties were heavy. Disease remained constant. American units initially struggled under conditions similar to those faced earlier by the 39th Battalion. And here's the irony. The Australians, who had been mocked as chocolate soldiers, were now among the most experienced jungle fighters in the theater. Their early suffering had forged practical expertise, patrolling technique, small unit coordination, understanding of terrain. The militia, who had once been dismissed, were now setting examples. By January 1943, Buna fell. Japanese losses were catastrophic. Very few defenders surrendered. Most fought to the death. The campaign in Papua ended, and with it ended any realistic Japanese threat to Port Moresby. Today, Kokoda is walked, not fought. Each year, Australians trek the same path, up the same ridges, through the same rain, past small wooden plaques marking where men fell. It takes modern hikers 8 to 10 days to complete the track, with equipment, with preparation, with no enemy. And even then, it breaks many of them. Now imagine doing it under fire, hungry, carrying ammunition, carrying wounded, carrying fear. That perspective changes everything. Kokoda was not glamorous. It was not mechanized. It did not feature tanks rolling across open plains. It was a test of human durability. And it proved something vital in 1942. Japan could be stopped, not by superior technology alone, but by refusal to collapse. The Japanese laughed at the retreating Australians. They saw militia. They saw weakness. They saw men who would melt. But mountains do not care about laughter. Mud does not care about rank. And endurance does not care about reputation. The 39th Battalion did not win by charging. They won by standing. They did not break the Japanese in a single day. They broke them one ridge at a time. And when the Imperial Army looked south from Ioribaiwa Ridge, they saw Port Moresby, and they never reached it because the so-called chocolate soldiers did not melt. They hardened. And in the mud of Kokoda, they became steel. If you enjoy stories about the moments where history could have gone differently, subscribe, because the next story is just as unbelievable.